Well, as Tony said, I'm Rebecca Granger, and I'm a fellow here at the Institute for Learning. And this morning, I have the pleasure of introducing an exciting guest to start off our conference, Duncan Andrade. Duncan Andrade is refreshingly real, and I don't say that lightly. He is a powerful speaker, but perhaps more powerful than his words are his actions. When he founded the Roses in Concrete Community School in East Oakland, California, to function as a center of health, he commented that a lot of people open schools because they can. They have a degree, they have a pulse, but that's the colonial model. You have to ask permission, not from the district or state, but from the community. A refreshingly unique approach. Another quote, "I feel like Oakland and these families adopted me, and I'm trying to spend the rest of my life repaying that debt." He seeks to serve rather than save. And with a PhD in social and cultural studies and education from UC Berkeley, he continues to serve, 24 years in the classroom teaching high school English. And that is in addition to being an associate professor of Raza Studies and Education Administration and Interdisciplinary Studies at San Francisco State University. He's an established author and a change maker. He works with schools across the country to develop classroom practices and school cultures that foster self-confidence, esteem, and academic success among students. Okay, one more quote, and then you can have the actual quote maker. Ooh, and I'm gonna tear up the stage as I do it, because he has so many words that inspire hope. But this one is speaking specifically on his research approach. The idea of, and I apologize to all of the Spanish speakers in the room because I'm gonna butcher this room, cariño, okay, or caring. And that's the idea of giving more to the research site than is taken. So here's his quote. "By focusing more directly on improving the immediate circumstances, it de-emphasizes the traditional method of searching for empirical truths that can be implemented on a large scale. Instead, it seeks to democratize the tools of research and knowledge creation. This way, when researchers leave, there remains behind a sense of hope and promise, one that is directly tied to the participants' sense of themselves as capable change agents. This kind of research also aims to leave behind research tools that can be used and reused to continually improve the conditions most in need of attention. This is unique because traditional research methods leave the tools in the hands of the researchers. So when the researchers leave, so do the tools to research, and to a large extent, so does the sense of agency." He's poignant, he's refreshingly real, and he's inspiring. I bring you Duncan Andrade.
And then, as part of our tradition, we also acknowledge what we refer to as the 7 generations principle. And this is the understanding that everything that we do in any particular given context is an echoing forward of 7 generations of our ancestors. And so we have to ask permission from our ancestors to also share palabra with you today. So I ask permission from my ancestors. And the 7 generations principle works in both directions. So we acknowledge that everything that we are doing in any given moment in time is simply a representation of the best of 7 generations of our ancestors, and we also acknowledge that everything that we do in any given moment of time echoes forward 7 generations. And so I want everyone in this room to be acknowledged for your sacred purpose and your value, and an understanding that everything that you do in this work will echo long past when you're no longer doing this work. And in that tradition, I want to acknowledge a young man that's one of your own, a young man that I met in October when I came to the University of Pittsburgh to do some work with Rich and his team. And I got to meet this young brother who was a senior in high school in Pittsburgh, and his name is Rashawn Gibson. And Rashawn was taken from us in December, not long after I got the chance to meet him and share palabra with him and some of his homies that came to the event. And on the flight here last night, I was sent an email from an educator that was working with him and some of his peers, and she told me that he had been murdered on his porch. And it reminded me again of how important this work is and how fleeting this work is that we do. And particularly in the academy, where we get all hyped up on our CV or some list of accomplishments that we've supposedly garnered over the course of our career. Being around young people like Rashawn on a daily basis reminds me about what really matters at the end of the day. Okay, and what really matters at the end of the day is not what we say in this conference. What really matters at the end of the day is not the research that we do and publish. What really matters at the end of the day is whether or not that work actually transforms the lives of young brothers like Rashawn. It's a show and prove game. Can we actually do the work that has meaning to the nation's most wounded children or not? And as Cornel West said many years ago, it does not look good at the moment. We've got a lot of work to do in our field. And part of doing that work means that we've got to fundamentally rethink the ways in which we approach the work. And the talk that I was asked to come and do today is really a response to a number of calls that I've been receiving with an increasing level of frequency probably over the last 5 to 7 years. And a number of districts and organizations and schools are all about equity now. Equity's all the rage. I'm so happy. That was a joke. I'm worried that equity's all the rage. I tell folks all the time, including our district in Oakland, that if you have an equity office or an equity officer, I guarantee you don't have equity. Now that may be the starting point. I'm not saying that you shouldn't have an equity officer, but equity, okay? Equity is, if you really have achieved equity, then everybody's an equity officer. And every office is an equity office. Okay? It's everywhere. It lives inside of the very culture of the institution where you do the work. Okay? Now, as part of this work to talk with folks and act as the thought partner around their efforts to push towards equity, I'm often asked to read strategic plans. And you would probably not be shocked by the frequency with which, when I'm reading these plans, and we're talking about some of the largest districts in the nation who are spending hundreds of thousands of dollars crafting up these strategic equity plans. And then I read the plans like, Jeff, what do you think? And I'm shocked at the number of times that I see these two words used interchangeably in those documents. A fundamental lack of understanding about the difference between equality and equity pretty much guarantees that you're not going to be on a path to equity. So I crafted this talk as a way to begin to help to inform the conversation as more and more spaces begin to realize the necessity of shifting from a conversation about an equal education system to an equitable education system. Now, I have really begun to understand the difference between equality and equity because I have twin boys. So I have a live experiment in my home about the difference between equality and equity. So these are my boys, Tayari and Amaru. And Amaru is constantly thirsty. So much so that this dude will literally drop a straw into just about anything to try to extract liquid. Okay? In this case, he jackpotted and got a coconut. And Tayari is constantly hungry. So much so that this dude will literally leave morsels of food on his shirt for later snacking. This is a picture of our family the first time. I shit you not, this is literally the first time we were out of the house. Okay, anybody in here have multiples? Okay, so you know exactly what I'm talking about. Right? You don't leave the house, and if you're going to come over, you better bring something. So this is the first time we're out of the house, and we're out at this spot in Oakland called Lake Merritt, where a lot of folks gather and hang out. And so this community member is walking by, and I pull out my phone. I'm like, hey, could you take a picture of our family? So he snaps this photo and hands it back to me, and I'm looking at the photo, and I'm like, what the hell is that? I call my son, Tayari, come here, son, come here, and I bring him over, and that is bark from that tree. So when I tell you that this boy is constantly hungry, we're literally talking about a young man that pulls bark off of trees and eats it. In this context, is this equal? Okay, who said no? Somebody just write out. Okay, gutturally, just no. Okay. Why isn't that equal?
Because I think that when you think about equal, if you really want to think about it, it can't just be about quantity. It's got to be about the situation and the context of the need.
Uh-huh. Are you a researcher? Mm-hmm. I just asked you a simple-ass question. Is this equal? And you want to give me this whole complex and that. This is a yes-no question. Is this equal? Oh, you said no. You're right. You still want to stick with that answer? Okay. I hope you're not a quantitative researcher. Okay. Because this is the definition of equal. This is absolutely equal. And see, your problem is that you blew right past the question. You went ahead and changed it, didn't you? You changed it from is this equal to is this fair?
I'm a literacy person, so I guess I changed the definition.
Yeah. There's nothing in the definition of equality that talks about fairness. This is the dictionary definition of equal. And it's also unfair. Now, since 1954, this nation has made a national commitment to creating equality in schools. In fact, the highest policy organization in the land, the Supreme Court of the United States, said it is the law of the land. This was the Brown versus Board decision. Brown v. Board is a decision about a decision. So Brown v. Board responds to another Supreme Court decision. Which decision was that? Plessy versus Ferguson. Plessy versus Ferguson said what? Separate is equal. Okay? Separate can be equal. And then Brown came and said, no, separate is by definition inherently unequal. Gary Orfield, who's at the University of California, Los Angeles, formerly of Harvard University, in the Harvard Civil Rights Project, now the UCLA Civil Rights Project, has been tracking the impact of Brown on the desegregation of U.S. city schools. Does anybody know how much progress we've made in the last 6 decades of equal education to the racial desegregation of city schools? Any guesses? Quantitative researchers only, please. Anybody? How much progress? 10%? 50%? We're going to do the prices right? 15%? 20%? 5%? 50%? What do you think? Nada. Worse than nada. We've gone backwards. City schools are more racially segregated now according to Orfield's research, than before the Supreme Court of the United States said that's illegal. That's the value of a policy. We can't policy our way out of this. Now, I'm not saying policy doesn't matter. Of course, the Brown decision matters. But if we don't pay attention to people, the people on the ground, it's a show and prove game. Does our work actually impact people? Because at the end of the day, if we don't start paying attention to the way in which our work impacts the people that actually have to do the work and the service, then we'll be looking 10 years from now at the same data. Now, equal education has had a significant impact on education and the nation writ large. Now, I think one of the mistakes that the right made is that they said in No Child Left Behind that we would be research-based and data-driven, which I think is fantastic. Problem is, we're not research-based or data-driven. The research is actually on the side of equity, as the opening commentary revealed once again. Study after study after study across fields, it's clear that equity is the superior growth model, it's a superior democratic model, it's a superior model for health and wellness in a society. Not equality. Now, equality in equal schools, quote-unquote equal schools, which, as I said earlier, we haven't achieved, has produced data. So let's look at some of our national data to see what 6+ decades of an equal education system has produced. Not long before Arne Duncan left office, he found himself all over mainstream media lauding himself and the Obama administration for their tremendous impact on high school graduation. And he was rolling out maps of the nation to show just how much impact they had on the nation's high school graduation. And he made the claim that this, under the Obama administration, that we achieved the highest high school graduation ever in the history of the country. Now, at the time, I was teaching high school at Fremont High School in East Oakland, which is my neighborhood high school. And if you know anything about East Oakland and anything about Fremont, you know that Fremont is not the business at all. And so I'm inside of a context hearing a data presentation from the nation's leading educator. And it didn't sit right with me. You see, my problem is they gave me a PhD. And as a part of that PhD, they trained me in how to read data. And so we went and got the data. And we reran it. And created 2 maps. This is not actually the map that Arne Duncan was sharing. This is a simple disaggregation of that map using only one control, income. So this is the high school graduation map for non-low-income students. Does this shock anyone? No, because our equal education system has done a pretty good job of serving middle and high-income kids for quite some time. And I say pretty good job because those are some of the same people that ended up creating predatory loans, the housing crisis, and all sorts of other things that I find socially questionable. But nonetheless, they are graduating. That's the map for low-income kids. If that's not a national crisis, pray tell what is. How can we even begin a conversation about a pluralistic, multiracial democracy when the children and the families that most need the public education to serve them are experiencing national failure? And I know exactly what you're thinking. Texas? Like all the Texans are like, yeah. Yeah, we kick ass. Hey. No, you don't. You cheat. It's true. Under Bush, his Secretary of Education came from Texas, and he had to leave summarily because they found out how he did so well. So this is not data. This is a representation of data. So when people start talking to you about data, make sure that you get the data, not somebody's interpretation of the data. Because part of what my training has taught me is that I can take pretty much any data set and tell all kinds of different stories just by how I choose to display it. Here's some more data. This is our national income data, not taken from some progressive think tank, but taken straight from the Congressional Budget Office. The United States is the global champs at income inequality. Point of fact, nobody else even comes close. We're also the global champs at locking up our own citizens. No country in the world has a higher per capita incarceration rate than this country. The country that for 6 decades has been committed to an equal education system. This is the Global Peace Index. Global Peace Index is used quite broadly on an international scale. UNESCO, the World Health Organization, the UN, all use the Global Peace Index. And every time I show this slide, the exact same thing happens that's happening right now. Everybody stops looking at me and they start looking at the rankings. Because the US is obsessed with rankings. No, we're not there. We did not make the top 15. We're 94th. Now, any index is worthy of critique and analysis. Any index is almost certainly incomplete. But if there's any index that you want to score well on, it's the Peace Index. And as a pluralistic, multiracial democracy committed to 6+ decades of equal education for all our citizens, the fact that we show up as a nation 94th in national peace levels is an indictment of a public education system that is clearly not serving the broader interests of a pluralistic, multiracial democracy. The 2016 index came out not long ago, and we're trending the wrong way. We are now 103rd. And what I find particularly interesting about this index is who's ahead of us. The very nation states that were all over the national scene critiquing for their lack of stability, their lack of infrastructural investment. And I doubt very, very seriously that anybody in this room lives a life anywhere close to 103. Most of us in this room live a life that's probably in the top 15 in terms of our general peacefulness. But Rashawn doesn't. And if as a nation in the aggregate we are ranked at 103, and all of us in this room are living somewhere in the top 15, what does that mean for where Rashawn's living or was living? Probably closer to 115. In 1854, London was under threat of total collapse because cholera was destroying the basic health infrastructure of the city. And in a last-ditch effort to save the city, some of the elected officials sequestered the top medical minds in London, locked them in a room, and said, "You're not coming out of here until you have a solution for cholera." And so they sat around a table and they knocked around ideas. And one doctor, in the middle of the debate, stands up and he says, "This is absurd." And they said, "What do you mean?" He says, "Every single solution we're coming up with defaults us to cholera. The starting point is that we're going to have cholera, and now we're just trying to figure out how to live with it. And they said, yeah. And he said, I didn't sign up to be a medical doctor just to treat sickness. I signed up to be a medical doctor to create the conditions of wellness. Why aren't we talking about how to eradicate cholera? And they said, well, you're not being pragmatic. You're not looking at the data. And I hear this all the time said to teachers who believe that a fundamental shift, a hard pivot, because you see, the pivot from equality to equity is not a soft pivot. It's a hard pivot. And we keep playing games about how we're going to address the achievement gap, the opportunity gap. We tinker around the edges. No fundamental rethink. No fundamental questioning in this nation about what is the purpose of public schools. Why do we take children from their parents for 13 years, 8 hours a day, and not even acknowledge the sacredness of that act? The sacredness of a parent giving their child to you is a sacred act in every single culture. And virtually every school that is wrestling with achievement gaps and opportunity gaps treats that as transactional. The parent drops their kid off, and the school doesn't even acknowledge what just happened. They don't even acknowledge the sacredness of their responsibility. And so the rest of the day becomes transactional. The rest of the day becomes an institutional relationship, cold and unfeeling at the most critical moments, when the child is most wounded and most suffering. Schools can't find a way to respond because of the very design and purpose of public schools in this nation. And the fact that we are not wrestling with that fundamental question means we can't make the hard pivot from equality to equity, because it has to be purpose-driven. And to be purpose-driven, you have to ask, why are we even doing this? The beginning point of that move is not the data. It's the question about why. And when this doctor stands up and asks that question, he's told he's not pragmatic. Just like teachers that stand up and ask that question are told they're not pragmatic. They're not looking hard enough at the data. And this doctor looks back at his colleagues and he said, if that's what it means to be part of your medical association, then I don't want to be part of your medical association. And they said, cool. And they showed him the door. That doctor's name was John Snow. No, not that John Snow. That John Snow. John Snow left the meeting of the leading medical officials in London and he hit the streets. And he became an ethnographer of the community that he aimed to serve. And the most effective educators that I've been around in my 24 years in this gig are first and foremost ethnographers of the communities that they serve. And so John Snow began conducting research, the kind of research I also like to conduct, where you actually have to talk to people. And he began interviewing as many people as he could, collecting data in London. And he interviewed as many people as he could that had cholera. And he interviewed as many people as he could that didn't have cholera. And what John Snow found is a researcher's dream. A perfect binary. He found causal. And what John Snow found was that every single person in London that had cholera drank from that water fountain. And every single person that didn't. So John Snow got a saw and he cut off the handle. And cholera stopped. Cut off the handle of the well that's pumping the conversation about equal education in a society that is fundamentally unequal at almost every turn. Equity means that if you are hungry, you get food. If you're thirsty, you get water. If you're hella thirsty, you get hella water. It is precisely your guttural response to the question. Before I can even figure out what I'm going to give you, I got to figure out what you need. Now, in these equity plans, the better of the group that I get the privilege of reading, I find that they're on to this. They're clear that schools and the broader system that is serving young people and families is going to have to do a better job of figuring out what they need. But the next challenge is not just saying that we're going to have full-service community schools, not just saying that we're going to provide mental health services, health and wellness, food, basic needs, but we learn from Brown, the mistake of Brown. In fact, the Supreme Court acknowledged the mistake. This is why there's Brown v. Board 1 and Brown v. Board 2. We had to have a second Brown decision because in fairly short order, the court realized that they'd missed one important detail in the insistence that we racially desegregate. And that important detail was they didn't say when. And so we get the line with all deliberate speed, which apparently means really slow. We'll test some backwards work first. Make sure, in your equity plan that you don't just say what you're going to do, but that you say when you're going to do it. Because now you're on the hook. And you may not meet your mark. You may miss your day or deadline. But you must commit to win, because if you don't, you've got a baked-in excuse for why you're not. We're working on that. And this is the hand-wringing that I see all over the nation about how we're finally going to meet the needs of the kids and the families that we continue to miss the mark on. Put a date on it. Now, some of the better work that I've seen about how to begin to think, both in theory and practice, about equity, what equity looks like, comes from John Powell and Angela Glover Backwell. Angela, who is the head of Policy Link, released a report called The Curb Cut Effect, which talks about designing policy and practice that doesn't just benefit the targeted group, but understands that the benefiting of the targeted group actually benefits the broader society. So she references curb cuts, which are what? Anybody know what curb cuts are? What's a curb cut?
It's the edge of the curb where it's sloped to provide access, particularly for people who use mobility.
Right. So it was a policy decision that we had to cut the curb at crossing points to allow for greater access for people who might be using a wheelchair or other kinds of aids and devices to help with their mobility. Who benefits from the curb cut? All of us. Children, toddlers, people riding bikes, people riding skateboards. You, when you sprain your ankle, twist your knee. You, just because you had one too many. All of us benefit from the curb cut, but the curb cut was specifically targeting one particular group. John Powell refers to this as targeted universalism. Both of these thinkers are making important contributions outside of our field to how we should be thinking about what it means to develop equity in schools and why it's an argument not just for poor kids, not just for kids of color, not just for kids that speak a language other than English, but for the entire nation. Everyone benefits when all our children have profoundly transformational educational experiences. But we've known this since 1943. And the truth about Maslow's work is that it is one of the best guides that I've ever had access to as a teacher. Every time I get stuck with a kid, I go back to Maslow. Don't give children more tutoring. Please don't send them to some kind of youth development program before you figure out what's really going on. And Maslow provides the perfect set of questions. Are you hungry? Do you have a place to stay? Are you naked? Please tell me you can easily assess that one. Okay. Do you need clothes? Especially in a place like Pittsburgh where the weather is for real. Are you safe? And when we think about safety in schools, we often think about physical safety, which is important. But there's so many layers to the research on safety. Are you identity safe? Right? Are you safe to speak your language? Are you safe to practice your cultura? Okay. Are you safe to be who you really are? If we get those squared away, do you feel a sense of love and belonging here? Do you feel loved? Do you feel like this is your space? And if we get that right, do you see your sacred value? Do you understand how important you are? Do you love yourself? Do you know who your ancestors are? Do you understand how important your ancestors are? And when we get those things right, what we know in the research is that those kids do pretty well in school. We also have pretty strong research about how to establish those things in children's lives, both in classrooms and in schools. We have good theory. We have good research. The gap in our field right now is the knowing-doing gap. We know what to do. We can't figure out how to do it on the ground with children because there it's messy. Here it's clean. My PowerPoint's going to work. My slides are going to be what I know they're going to be. It's all good. On the ground with children, it's messy. And the meaning is in the mess. And we keep trying to sanitize schools. We keep trying to sanitize the classroom instead of embracing the messiness. Now, what we find in the research is that the teachers and the school spaces that most consistently hit the mark for the kids that need us to hit the mark the most tend to focus on these three things: relationships, relevance, and responsibility. No matter what the policy reign is of the day, whether it's No Child Left Behind, Common Core, the latest, greatest from Hope Mifflin and Pearson, they stay focused on the things that time has honored as the most significant in engaging and transforming the experience that young people have in schools. And so for the second part of this talk, what I'm going to do is armor you up to go do this work in the space where you do this work, because there is almost no debate across fields about these three domains and why they matter so much. And when I say across fields, I mean across fields. Public health, social epidemiology, neuroscience, all agree. Child development, psychology, all agree that these are the three marks that we got to hit if we're going to engage and transform the experiences the kids were missing with. Before I dig into those, I want to acknowledge that Maslow himself acknowledged that he appropriated the hierarchy of needs. Maslow came up with the concept of the hierarchy of needs by spending an extensive amount of time with the Blackfoot people. This is him on the res with Blackfoot Nation. And in his early writing, he talks about this. He talks about this as an indigenous paradigm. And he said what was so profound to him about the Blackfoot people is that they had actually inverted the paradigm or the concepts in the paradigm. So a First Nations perspective has what Maslow lists as the hierarchy of needs with self-actualization as the base. Because the outcome for us is not the individual. The outcome for us is the community. So we are at our highest level, not when we're self-actualizing. We're at our highest level of humanity when we're self-actualizing for community actualization and cultural prosperity. The community. And schools, by their very design, are interruptive of a collective community sensibility because it's all about your grades. And in point of fact, you're actually encouraged in school to block her off so that you can get more. Think about what the message to children is. When we sit exams and you got an answer for the exam question, and she doesn't, and if you share the answer with her, what are you? Say no more. We cannot be a pluralistic, multiracial democracy when that is the cultural norm for 13 years for children. We can't do it. You can't. You have to help her. You have a moral and social obligation if you have knowledge and information to share it. That's a First Nations perspective. And what Maslow said is that we are a society upside down. Eduardo Galeano writes the book Upside Down for that very same reason. Up is down, right is wrong, good is bad, bad is good. And clearly, the new administration is right on point. Because we've normed it in our base institutions that every single child in this democracy accesses for a tremendous amount of time, oftentimes more than they access their own families. And Maslow says as long as this paradigm is necessary in this nation state, we have no chance to live up to our rhetorical ideas. We're just playing games. But he says we have to start here. We actually have built a society in 1943 where we actually have to say as a society, you have to feed children. You have to clothe children. You have to provide safety. And he says, this cannot be the paradigm that holds for us as a nation, but we've got to start there. We've got to start saying this as the baseline for wellness until we get to the place where this gets inverted and we never have to say again that we have to feed our children because it's a base expectation in our society. And this is precisely why Herb Kohl famously said, kids don't care what you know until they know that you care. And what I love about Herb's research is he's one of the only researchers that studied failure as logical. Herb spent so much time in schools and he kept finding all these kids that would show up to school every day and flunk. Any teachers in the room? How many of you have ever had a kid who comes to class every day and then you look at the grade book and it's all zeros? Herb says that's your most committed student. And he coins a term called willed not learning. So I'm going to encourage you to attempt to experience what that student experiences during the course of this conference. As soon as I get done, I want you to attempt to learn nothing for an hour. So the next keynote speaker, don't learn a damn thing from them. Okay? Try it. It's really, really hard. Right? And what Herb lifts up in his research is that there's a willfulness there on the part of the child to not learn. And when he interviews these kids, right? About you're coming to school every day. How are you failing? Right? And interview after interview after interview, the kids would talk about the fact that they would not learn from people that they didn't believe cared about them. And one kid finally says to him, right? He says, I don't care what a teacher knows until I know that the teacher cares. And the neuroscience bears this out with total clarity. Robert Sapolsky is considered one of the nation's leading experts on stress and how stress affects the body and how it interrupts neural pathways and a young person's capacity to fully show up and be who we're asking to be in schools. His book, Why Zebras Don't Get Ulcers, is mandatory reading in virtually every medical field. And yet I find almost no educators have read it. And I actually don't recommend it. It's like 600 pages of 6-point font. But he has a great summary of the text if you don't nerd out on like high-end neuroscience research. Hey, there's a great documentary film made on his research put out by National Geographic called Stress the Silent Killer, which is some of the most informative neurological research that I've experienced as an educator that was immediately applicable to the work that I do and to the way that I interact with the students that are the most stressed. Brené Brown's work has become increasingly popular because of her TED Talk, but a lot of folks don't know that Brené also wrote a New York Times bestseller. And Brené, like an increasing number of researchers in neuroscience, social epidemiology, public health, neurobiology, are increasingly interested in empathy and the difference between empathy and sympathy. When you have a sympathetic interaction with somebody, what happens to your biorhythms and your neurobiology? Nothing. Nothing happens. And nothing happens to the person who you're having a sympathetic connection to. Because sympathy is what? When you have a sympathetic reaction to somebody, hey, what is your reaction? What are you feeling? Yeah, you're feeling bad for them, right? Sucks to be you. What about an empathetic? Yeah. Hey. How many of you have young people that say, I feel you? I feel you, dog. I feel you. Okay? That's just not some hip-hop stuff. That's empathy. I feel you. What happens to your body when you have an empathic relationship with someone? Your body literally transforms. Your neural pathways are changed. Your biochemistry is changed. You release a set of chemicals in your body that's actually good for your body. And so does the person that you make the connection with. The research is crystal clear about this. Empathy is good for your health. Schools are not designed to create empathic connections between adults and children and children and children. And so schools are missing an opportunity to create wellness just by virtue of relationship. And the list goes on and on and on. Some of the top thinkers from the top research institutions around the country are crystal clear that at the end of the day, teaching and learning often boils down to one thing and one thing only, and that's relationships. And if we don't think much harder about what those relationships need to look like, the chance for us to get to quote-unquote deeper learning from a purely research perspective is literally interrupted. Now, if we get those kind of relationships, then the question is, well, what are we actually teaching kids? How is it relevant? How is it helping us create this nation that we've said we want to create? Now, I'm not big on checklists, but I'm going to give you one right now. If you are an educator and or working with educators that claim to want to be culturally and community responsive. Here's your checklist. Does the curriculum and pedagogy connect to students' lives, their communities, their families, and their ethnic, cultural, and linguistic histories? If it does not, it is not culturally and or community responsive, period. Which means that you cannot create culturally responsive materials using Hope Mifflin and Pearson. You can't do it. Apparently there's some Pearson haters in the room. And that's not to say that you can't use that textbook. Right? You can use that textbook to critique that textbook. But there's no way that a corporate entity can create community responsive curriculum for all the communities where they're pushing their curriculum. They can't. So we're going to have to rethink what it means to be culturally and community responsive. If you have black youth and you have them read the autobiography of Malcolm X, this does not make you culturally responsive. And the research clearly bears this out across fields. I want you to understand that in the research community, there's virtually no debate about these things. The only place where they debate it is in schools. Okay? So in the debate, we are expected to be research-based and data-driven. And we should be. So use the research. When people roll out the latest, greatest assessment, when they roll out their Holt Mifflin and Pearson curriculum, ask them, cool, fantastic, can I see the research that supports this curriculum and this assessment? And you know what they'll say? Yes. And they'll show you some research. And then what you want to ask them is, who did that research? And they'll say, our internal research team. Right? And you say, what did they find? That it's really good, huh? Ask for an external, independent research evaluation of their curriculum and their textbook and their assessment, and they'll get stuck. Because there is no external research assessment of those approaches, because they don't produce the outcomes they promise to produce. And then the beauty of it is the package that it gets wrapped in. Because when you don't get the results that they promised you, it's because you didn't implement with fidelity. It's user error. It's not user error. It's design error. And the research outside of our field widely accepts that fact. So let's use that research to begin to drive the pivot towards equity. Why does this matter so much? The relevance. Well, we know in the research is that when students find the curriculum and the pedagogy relevant, it actually builds their knowledge of themselves. And we have very clear research in child development psychology and neuroscience to show that as that happens, children's self-esteem goes up. Where did you see self-esteem earlier in this presentation? Where in Maslow? Okay, no, not the top. It's the window to the top. Right? This is why ethnic studies is so important. And ethnic studies isn't just for kids of color. White kids need them some ethnic studies too. All of us have indigeneity. All of us have indigenous land and indigenous culture and ancestors. And the fact that so many people in this nation are disconnected from that or believe that their indigeneity started in 1776 is a fundamental cultural problem for the nation. And schools either perpetuate that or they interrupt that. Do children graduate from our public schools really knowing who they are, the greatness that they come from, their connectedness? Because if they don't know who they are, there's no way they can mix medicines with other people. We know that there is a direct relationship between a child's self-esteem and their hope levels. The medical field is measuring hope because it's the only indicator they've found that directly links to a child's capacity to navigate effectively through toxic stress over time. If you're familiar at all with some of my other research, this is where I turned my research as a practitioner. I baseline hope in my high school classroom because I know what the research says. And the research says that if you don't move the meter on hope, you're just teaching kids how to play school. But if they become hopeful, if you practice and you can measure hope, look at the work of Charles Schneider and the Children's Hope Scale. Okay? There's ways that the medical field is measuring hope because they've realized that as hope levels go up, okay, so does a child's resiliency and sense of agency. And we know that there's a direct relationship between a child's hope level and their ability to interrupt what Claude Steele calls stereotype threat. How many of you work in schools, serve schools that test children? Then you need to read Claude's work. It's some of the compelling work we have in the field of research about why kids, particularly kids of color, don't perform well on high-stakes exams. How many of you have had a student that can do the work, and then they sit exam and they underperform? Claude's work, among many others, now has begun to peel back the layers on why that is. We now can actually understand what happens neurologically and biochemically inside the child's body when they sit the exam. And what literally happens with stereotype threat is you're flooded with a set of chemicals that literally alters and interrupts your neural pathways, which then makes it difficult for you to recall what you know. Because stress changes your neural pathways in the snap of your fingers. And you literally, things that you know are no longer accessible to your brain because you're so stressed about what that exam's going to mean for you as a black boy, as a brown girl. We also have very clear research that when you interrupt stereotype threat, when you build hope and self-esteem, that it creates a positive Pygmalion effect. Okay? Pygmalion effect is a term from psychology that is, in effect, the self-fulfilling prophecy. Every teacher, every day, is creating a Pygmalion effect. There is always a Pygmalion effect in your classroom. The question is whether it's a negative Pygmalion effect or a positive Pygmalion effect. There is clear research from the last 3 decades that the single biggest indicator of student performance is teacher expectation, because teacher expectation creates the Pygmalion effect. And last, Carol's work has become all the rage. How many of you are in schools that use growth mindset? Even Carol Dweck is pissed off at how people are using growth mindset. She had to create a whole new lecture to undo the first lecture. Right? Look at her latest stuff. She's back on the lecture circuit chastising people for what the hell is wrong with you? Didn't you read what I wrote? Don't watch the damn TED Talk. Read the book. Read the book. Right? And what she says is that growth mindset has been misapplied in schools, particularly the schools that most need a growth mindset. Because schools are like, that's it. Growth mindset. I knew it. I knew it. These kids need a growth mindset. And Dweck was like, oh, shit. The mindset of the children we serve simply reflects the mindset of the adults serving them. Okay? So if children don't have a growth mindset, that means you don't have a growth mindset. Right? The work of growth mindset has to be applied to the adults. And we have really strong research that shows when teachers have a growth mindset, when teachers believe that their students are capable and brilliant and come from greatness, it transforms what the student believes about themselves and their capacity to meet those expectations. Now, I've been in schools all over the country okay, and had the privilege to be in many schools around the world. And at the Roses and Concrete Community School, which is the lab school that we opened in East Oakland last year, we only have one school partner in the world. And it's a Maori school in New Zealand called Kia Roha College, and Te Whanau Tuparanga is the Maori section of that school. And they are our only partner because they are the school, in my estimation, of all the schools that I've been in, that does this better than anybody. They understand culture and how to embed culture in every single edge of their work in a way that I've never seen in a U.S. school. Now, I'm going to show you a video clip from my first visit to their school 14 years ago. And this is actually our last day there. So we had been there 10 days when you see this. But our first day there, we went through a similar rite of passage with them. And after my first day there, my wife and I, this is before we had our boys, we went back to our apartment. And when I got inside the door of the apartment where we were staying, I literally broke down. I started weeping. And my wife was like, what's going on? And I said, for the first time in my life, I realize what has been taken from me in schools. Seeing is believing. One of the most important things that we can do as educators is to get access to spaces that are doing it better than us. Because when you see it, you can't deny it anymore that it's possible. The questions that you ask change. It's not whether or not we can, it's how can we. So what I'm going to show you in this clip is actually the end of that first visit. And you're going to see two things. The first thing that you're going to see, the entire community performing a rite of passage that in indigenous communities we refer to as a mixing of medicines. In the Rasa community we say la cultura cura, which means what? So literally it means the culture cures or the culture heals. But there's always stuff lost in translation. It's not really what la cultura cura means. What la cultura cura means is that your culture is your medicine. And if you have your cultura with you, you can always heal yourself. And you can always heal other people. In indigenous communities, we believe that when we come across other people, so if I cross your path and I have my cultura and you have your cultura, what can we do? We can mix medicines. And your cultura can become stronger and my cultura can become stronger. But we ask our children to check their cultura at the door. And we'll give you your cultura. We'll culture you. How many of you have ever had medicine shoved down your throat? Feel like you're getting better? That's what we do to kids all the time in schools. It's not that the culture that we're giving them is bad. It's the way in which we're giving it to them. That we're not actually letting them mix the medicine. We're just shoving the medicine down their throat. This is why so many kids reject school. It's not actually Shakespeare that they don't like. It's the way in which we teach Shakespeare, that we make them filter Shakespeare through a European lens. And if you're not European, you can't read Shakespeare through a European lens. You have to read Shakespeare through the lens of your ancestors. And this is what the Maori community gets. Their instructional paradigm begins with, first you are Maori. And until you understand what that means, anything else I teach you won't matter because you'll filter it through the wrong eyes. So what you're going to see in this video clip is some of the best evidence of the difference between a school that teaches information and a school that teaches knowledge. Knowledge is a gift. And I'm not saying that schools shouldn't teach information. I pass information. I test for recall. But I'm more interested in the knowledge that my students get access to when they're with me. How many of you gave a gift to someone this year? Show of hands. Okay? Generally giving community here. All right, so after you gave the gift, Did you then come back a week later and say, okay, you know that gift I gave you yesterday? In 3 weeks, I'm going to come back again, and I'm going to give you an exam to test the degree to which you actually properly received the gift that I gave you. And then I'm going to assess you on how well you tell me you received that gift, and I'll let you know whether or not you pass. How many of you did that? Thank goodness. Right, because that's absurd, because you don't do that with gifts. Knowledge is a gift. If you're giving the gift of knowledge in schools, knowledge is the gift of the ancestors. It's wisdom. It's understanding your own value. If we're giving that to children in schools, then the children decide how they redistribute that gift and when they redistribute that gift. And so what you're going to see in this video is both. You're going to see in the beginning information. You're going to see the whole community doing something that is clearly on script. And I think there's a role for that in schools. And then you're going to see something that's off script. And you're going to know it's off script because of what happens with the camera. So there's a 16-year-old filming this. So don't blame me for the filming. Right? And you're going to know that it's off script because when it gets off script, she low-key loses her mind. So if you have like motion issues, you're going to need to turn away because she goes all over the place with the camera trying to figure out what's happening. And then eventually she locks it back in on this group of boys, 25 Maori boys that I spent every day with in the 10 days that I was there. Not unlike the day that I spent with Rashawn when I was here. And those boys decided that before I went back to East Oakland, that they had to give me a gift that in the Maori community you can't ask for. And that gift that they give me was only made possible because they went to this school. They came to this school not speaking Maori, not knowing Maori culture. This is what in the U.S. we would consider a continuation school. These are all kids who have been put out of mainstream British schooling in New Zealand, and so they end up here. And in my estimation, it is the best evidence of a school that teaches knowledge over information. never seen anything like that in a U.S. school. Frankly, that would scare the shit out of most U.S. schools. Now, up until 2 years ago, 12 years into our relationship, I had never seen their data. I didn't need to, because that is data, what you just saw. 2 years ago, their principal was the keynote at our national conference for the Teaching Excellence Network, which is the network of schools that we're building that are committed to these kinds of practices with our young people. And in her keynote, she showed their data. Now, I get to look at a lot of educational data as a part of my role as a researcher, and this is the most compelling educational data I've ever seen. Now, they measure many of the same things that we do. The NZ standards are often modeled straight off of U.S. standards. So they measure reading, writing, and maths. I attempted to correct them and said, you put an S on the end of your math, and she said, no, you don't. Okay? But they also measure relationships and cultural identity. Now, when you look at this data, the entry point for this cohort of kids when they come in, is it any surprise that Maori youth in a colonial context coming from U.S. whites or New Zealand white schools have poor relationships and a very low sense of cultural identity? No, it's not surprising. Now, what do you see in year one of the data? What's happening with relationships and cultural identity? Right, it's skyrocketing. It's on a vertical trend. What about reading, writing, and maths? It's flat. And in the U.S., we bail. And we say things like, this is why you can't do ethnic studies. It just makes kids mad. It doesn't actually help them read, write, or do math better. But the Maori, when they see that these things are not moving, their response is different. They say, oh, you're not doing well on reading and writing and math because you don't even know who you are yet. So they double down on relationships and cultural identity. What do you see happen in year two? The gains that we want start appearing, because this is exactly what the research says. This is the most compelling educational data I've seen because it actually measures what matters. If you don't measure relationships and cultural identity, it doesn't matter to you. And the kids know it. It's just a game we're playing. How are we going to measure the things that matter, and how are we going to begin to create more complex data conversations that are looking at what the research indicates are the preconditions? What are the precursors to the reading, writing, and math trends that you want to see? You're going to have to look outside of education for those markers, but we have clear evidence about what those are in the fields that I've been listing off already. Now, I'll end with our responsibility. Every time you get stuck with a student, with a teacher, with a principal, with a super that you're working with, triple down on Maslow. Go back to basic needs: food, clothing, shelter, safety, love and belonging, self-esteem, and the rest will begin to take care of itself. Don't overthink it. Don't overprogram it. Get back to relationship. What's really going on? If you're working in communities that are experiencing high levels of toxic stress and trauma, here's your primer. Bruce Perry is considered the nation's leading expert on child trauma. His book, The Boy Who Was Raised as a Dog, is one of the best pieces that I've seen for teachers that are really trying to become, quote unquote, trauma informed or trauma responsive. Here's some other light reading for you when you get bored over the summer. Robert Putnam. Oxford called Robert Putnam the world's most influential scholar. A dubious honor, to be sure, but his work suggests in his most recent work. So bowling alone sort of puts him on the map, but his most recent work is a book called Our Kids, that is his treatise on the ways in which the education system is actually creating division in our society and what it is that we can do to begin to right that ship. Unnatural Causes is a 7-part film series from PBS that is the largest global study ever conducted on inequality. It is a global research study of the question, is inequality making us sick? Short answer, yes. Biggest threat to health on the planet is inequality. And lastly, Michelle Alexander's work, The New Jim Crow. I encourage educators to read this because the writing of a referral is not a benign act. We have clear research evidence that suggests that once we go ink to paper on a child, the likelihood that they contact the juvenile justice system goes up exponentially. And if they contact the juvenile justice system, the likelihood that they contact the pen goes up exponentially. The first point of contact around that is almost always schools. What are we going to do as an alternative to the ways in which we respond to children's behaviors that we find inappropriate? Because what we're doing now is literally fueling the world's largest penal system. Michelle Alexander's work gives us a great look into how that's happening and what we can do differently. And I'll end by letting you come into my classroom, just in case you think I'm up here just talking shit, okay? Which I kind of am, but I actually do the work too. When I think about my responsibility as an educator, I think about this student that you're about to hear from. Now, I need to say 2 things to introduce this clip. The first is that this clip may trigger some of you because of what she's going to share. And if it does, please take the space that you need. And if someone next to you gets triggered, acknowledge their humanity. Acknowledge what it is that they're experiencing. The second thing I want to say is that this child that's going to share with you, this is 2 years into our work. So as a high school teacher, I looped. Okay? And I historically have looped for 4 consecutive years with kids. So I'm their high school English teacher in 9th grade, 10th grade, 11th grade, 12th grade. This kid that's going to share with you is literally my neighbor. She's from the 3400 block in East Oakland, just like me. And I watched her come up. And then in 9th grade, she popped up in my freshman English class. And at that point, I'd been teaching 16 years. And I had never had a fight in my class. Ever, in deep East Oakland, which is no joke to not have a fight in your class. And on her first day, she chucks him in my class. My frickin' neighbor breaks the record. Exactly who was supposed to break the record. Her first day is that. This is 6 weeks into year 2, and where she's at that point. Relationships, relevance, and responsibility require time. We want the most wounded children to transform themselves overnight. Their woundedness took years, if not decades, if not generations, to build. We have to make that same commitment to healing in schools if we're really going to meet those kids where they're at. So this piece that she shares is my reminder about my responsibility as an educator in my community every day.
My poem is called More Skies and Birthdays. If I had a gun pointed to my head and my life flashed before my eyes, I would see the times I would smoke with my cousins, drinking, smacking, throwing powder till I knew I was too gone. Cheating on my boyfriend with my ex because he would tell me he still loved me. Lying to the people I love. Hurting the people that care about me the most. And then I would see the reason why. I would see a little girl
You can do it.
I would see a little girl getting raped at the age of 4 years old. She didn't know what to do or who to talk to. She was so afraid that she would cry and not tell anybody. She stayed silent. I would see 4 years passing by, rape after rape after rape. I would see an 8-year-old girl with more scars than birthdays. I would see a 13-year-old girl getting raped by her first real boyfriend. I would see a girl who didn't know how to love herself. I would see me. And if I had a gun pointed to my head and I had minutes left to live, I would tell that little girl it's okay to tell your mom. It's safe to cry. Go through your pain so you can heal. Drugs will not heal your pain, will not block it out. Love yourself. One day, trust somebody, love somebody. Let yourself be loved. If I had a gun pointed at my head, I would cry and tell 15-year-old me, I love you, don't regret your mistakes. Because I've learned that my mistakes are the lesson I needed to learn so I could create a better future.
How do we create classrooms that can hold that? Where kids can come and share that palabra, and it doesn't become cyberbullying. It doesn't become chisme in the hallways. You heard those young people holding her. Go ahead, we got you. And they're holding her because they're up next. And they got the same story. And they're going to need to be held. That's how we raise test scores. That's how we raise engagement. That's how we raise achievement. When writing and reading and math and science actually have a purpose right now, not in some distant future, not some promise that I'm going to attend the Ivy League or the UC system, but right now, what you're learning can transform your life. Right now, what you're learning can literally save your life, your cousin's life, your sister's life, your little sister who's going through the same thing that you're going through right now as a 15-year-old. You can help relieve her suffering by virtue of you learning how to write your story. This is why 90% of the kids that come through our program go to 4-year schools. Not because we have some special mechanism for teaching them writing. Because we understand that to get to the head of the most wounded children, you have to win the heart. It's the heart work that's absent in the educational research and practice. And it's the heart work that transforms the head work. And if you keep banging on kids' heads whose entire life experience has taught them to lock you out of their heads, you're wasting your time and theirs. But if we can get back to the real reason that we're supposed to have public schools in a pluralistic, multiracial democracy, we always land on her. Because if our schools can't meet the needs of our most wounded children, we failed as a nation. And we need look no further than our national data on health and wellness and peace to know where we sit. The pivot is hard, y'all. It's hard, but it's transformative. And I'll end where I began, with the wisdom of our indigenous ancestors from this land. And the Cherokee people, like many indigenous communities, have a story that they tell about this little boy who was out in the front yard playing, and he comes bursting into the house, and he runs up to his abuelita, and he says, "Abuelita, I feel like there's a war going on inside my head, abuelita." And she says, "There is, mijo." And he says, "Who's fighting, abuelita?" And she says, "The two wolves." And he says, "Who are the two wolves, abuelita?" And she says, "One wolf is rage, avarice, greed, selfishness, violence." And he says, "Who's the other wolf, abuelita?" And she says the other wolf is cariño, empathy, love, familia, community. And he says, who wins, abuelita? And she says, the one you feed. These wolves are inside all of us. They're inside every child that we serve, every family that we serve. That's not the question. The question is when we will start feeding that wolf that rhetorically we've committed to, but that in practice we've turned our backs on. How are we going to create that school system? How are we going to measure that? The research is on our side. The open question is whether or not we have the will to do that work with the children that need it the most. If I can help you in any way on that journey, please do not hesitate to reach out. This will not be done by yourself. It will not just be done in Pittsburgh. We're banging on this in East Oakland. We're banging on this in Otara in New Zealand. This is a global effort to transform what it is that schools do in communities like ours. Thank you.